I knew I was the ghost in the machine the day our lead sales guy toasted to another year of flawless uptime at the holiday party without looking in my direction. That flawless uptime was me: 3 a.m. code patches, server restarts during my kid's birthday party, bug fixes while sitting in a dentist's chair. The product might have had the company's name on it, but the blood type in its veins was mine. I was the one quietly keeping the gears turning, the one making sure the thing didn't fall apart in front of a client demo. Nobody noticed when I caught the small stuff, and when the big stuff went wrong, I was the one in the hot seat while everyone else played the blame game from a safe distance. My boss, Mark, thrived on that imbalance. He was the kind of guy who called every meeting critical but spent the first 10 minutes talking about his weekend golf scores. He didn't yell, he didn't have to. He'd just lean back in his overpriced chair, raise an eyebrow, and ask pointed questions like, "So, why didn't you think of that earlier?" In front of a dozen people. Subtle enough that you couldn't call it an attack, sharp enough that you felt the sting for the rest of the day. One time, he joked during a quarterly review that if I ever left, the whole platform would crumble for about 5 minutes before they replaced me with a cheaper contractor. Everyone laughed. Because what else do you do when the guy who signs your paycheck is taking a shot at you? I smiled too, but filed that little moment away in the back of my mind with all the others. I kept a lot of things filed away. And hey, while you're here, let me slide in something quick. 97% of folks who listen to these stories never hit subscribe. If you're in that 97%, do me a solid and click it. It actually keeps this whole thing alive, and the team caffeinated enough to keep digging up these revenge tales. All right, back to Mark. He had a habit of sitting in on technical meetings just long enough to misunderstand what was going on, then leave halfway through to take a client call. But when a project shipped, he was front and center in the company newsletter, pictured in front of a whiteboard full of my handwriting. He'd pat my shoulder afterward and say, "You're a real team player," like he was giving me a medal. I learned early on that if you wanted credit, you had to fight for it, and fighting for it just made him dig in harder. The real kicker was how he managed people like chess pieces. He didn't care if you liked him, he just wanted you to remember who controlled the board. I watched him quietly freeze out a senior developer by rerouting all her projects to someone else until she quit. He'd act surprised when someone left, as if they'd just ghosted him for no reason. He liked keeping people slightly off balance. It made them easier to maneuver. For me, it was a slow burn. I never raised my voice, never stormed out of a meeting. I just did my job so well he had no choice but to keep me around, until the day I realized I had something in my back pocket that made his power games look like kid stuff. But that part? That would come later. For now, my life was a rotation of 12-hour days, quiet fixes, and watching him take credit for things he couldn't explain if you spotted him the first 3 sentences. I didn't drink at company happy hours anymore. I'd learned too many loose comments found their way back to him, twisted into something useful for his next little performance. I sat at the far end of the conference table, notebook open, eyes down. I was the dependable one, the safe pair of hands, the guy you called at 2 a.m. when the system went belly up. And every time I solved a problem that could have sunk us in front of a client, I'd look over at Mark and see that satisfied smirk. The smirk that said he'd found another way to turn my work into his win. I didn't mind, at least, that's what I told myself. Because while he was busy playing office politics, I was quietly building something that had nothing to do with his approval, his smirk, or his little chessboard. The truth was, he didn't even know the game I was playing. And by the time he figured it out, he'd already moved his king into check without realizing it. It happened on a Tuesday, because of course it did. Tuesdays are when bad news feels both too early and too late in the week to fight back. I'd just finished untangling a catastrophic memory leak that had been quietly bleeding server performance for months when Mark's assistant appeared at my desk, tapping her tablet like she was double-checking a death sentence. "Mark wants to see you in his office. HR will be there." That combination, Mark plus HR, wasn't a meeting, it was an execution. His glass-walled corner office overlooked the whole floor like a hunter's blind. Walking toward it was like walking across a stage, every keyboard click on the floor suddenly quieter, every conversation suddenly shifting into a whisper. People pretended to keep working, but I could feel the stairs following me. I kept my head level, my pace steady. Mark was leaning back in his chair when I walked in, one ankle resting casually on his knee. Beside him sat a woman from HR with a folder on her lap, smiling the way people do when they've already decided you're gone. Mark gestured to the seat opposite him. "Let's get right to it," he said, voice smooth like he was closing a routine sale. "We're making some changes in the department. Unfortunately, that means we're going to have to let you go." He paused, letting the words hang like cigarette smoke. HR slid the termination packet across the desk as if she were delivering a fine meal. "Effective immediately," she added, like it was a detail that might have slipped my mind. Then came the flourish. Mark's lips curved into that smirk I knew too well, and he said, "You can collect your plant when facilities approves." The way he said it, like it was a privilege I'd need to apply for, was pure Mark. I glanced over my shoulder at the little pothos on my desk, the one I'd kept alive through 2 office relocations and one winter when the heating system nearly froze it solid. He was using it as the final insult, the last word in a conversation he thought he controlled. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I nodded once, tucked the folder under my arm, and stood. All right, I said, voice even. Guess I'll get out of your way. Walking back to my desk was the same as walking to his office, eyes flicking up from monitors, coworkers pretending they weren't watching the end of a show they'd been following for years. I unlocked my laptop, slid it into its case, and set my company badge on top. The sound of the zipper closing was louder than I expected, like the final snap of a trap shutting. No one said a word. No sorry to hear, no good luck. In an office like ours, showing sympathy to someone on the way out was like painting a target on your own back. I'd seen it happen before, so I didn't take it personally. Inside, though, I wasn't hollowed out or panicked like he probably assumed. I wasn't rehearsing my resume in my head or wondering how I'd pay my mortgage. I was thinking about the file folder in my home desk drawer, thick with signed documents, attorney's notes, and the patent certificate with my name printed in crisp black ink. The one thing that could pull the rug out from under this company faster than Mark could come up with another condescending remark. As I walked out with my bag slung over my shoulder, I caught my reflection in the lobby glass. I looked calm, too calm maybe. Mark thought this was the final scene. He thought my story ended in that conference room with a plant-shaped insult. But the truth, this wasn't an ending. It was just a pivot. And the next act was already in motion. 2 years before Mark pulled his little collect your plant stunt, I was sitting in my apartment at 1:30 in the morning, half-eaten lo mein on the desk, when I cracked the last piece of a problem that had been gnawing at me for months. It wasn't even part of my job, at least, not officially. This was one of those ideas that wouldn't leave me alone, the kind that follows you into the shower, interrupts you in the grocery store, keeps you awake long after the rest of the world has gone to bed. I'd been watching the way our system handled data, bloated processes, unnecessary loops, 1,000 little inefficiencies no one wanted to touch because they worked fine. But fine was costing the company a fortune in processing time and cloud storage. What I'd sketched out in my notebook was a different approach entirely: lean, efficient, able to cut resource usage by a third without sacrificing performance. The beauty was in its simplicity. I could explain it to a junior dev in under a minute, but it would take a competitor years to replicate from scratch. When I finally got it working, I sat back and just stared at the output. It was clean, fast, elegant. It felt like finding a secret door in a house you'd lived in for years. I knew exactly what I had, and more importantly, I knew it didn't belong to the company. I'd written every line on my own time, on my own hardware, using nothing from their code base. It wasn't theirs, it was mine. A week later, I filed a provisional patent in my name. I didn't tell Mark. I didn't tell anyone. I figured it was better to have it on record than to leave it floating around in my personal files. A provisional patent is like planting a flag. You've got a year to decide if you want to go all in. Most people never bother unless they're planning to sell something. I wasn't. At the time, I just wanted to protect the idea. Then the company discovered it. I'd mentioned the concept in passing during a lunch conversation with another engineer, and 2 months later, I saw pieces of my approach showing up in production. They hadn't taken my exact code, just the method, the structure, the little efficiencies I'd stitched together. It wasn't theft, not exactly, but it was close enough that my stomach nodded the first time I saw it in action. When I brought it up to legal, they waved it off. Since you haven't commercialized it independently, it's not really relevant, one of the lawyers said without looking up from his laptop. Translation: if it's not making you money, it's not worth our time. I walked out of that meeting knowing 2 things. 1, they didn't see the value, and 2, they didn't realize how much they were building on top of it. Over the next 18 months, they wove that algorithm into everything. Client-side tools, back-end processes, even new product features Mark was bragging about at conferences. It all ran on the framework I'd designed. They treated it like it was just another component in the machine, never once stopping to think that maybe the foundation they were standing on didn't actually belong to them. That's when I started keeping track. Every update, every deployment, every public-facing feature that leaned on my design, I logged them all. I wasn't planning revenge yet. It was more like insurance. Because someday, I knew I might need a reminder that I wasn't as powerless as Mark liked to pretend. What they didn't realize, and what gave me a quiet, almost guilty kind of satisfaction, was that the provisional filing was still there, time-stamped and unassailable. All it needed was the right moment to be converted into a full patent. And when that moment came, I wouldn't just be holding a card they didn't know existed. I'd be holding the card that could take the whole game off the table. About a month before the Tuesday ambush in Mark's office, I was sitting in a cramped conference room at the back of a small law firm, the kind with filing cabinets older than the paralegal who'd brought me coffee. Across from me sat Victor, an IP attorney I'd known for years, the kind of guy who could read patent language the way a cardiologist reads X. I'd worked with him once before on a side project, And I knew he understood two things better than most lawyers: how to protect an idea and how to bury a landmine in plain sight. I slid the thick folder across the table. "It's time," I said. He didn't need to ask what I meant. Provisional patent I'd filed 2 years earlier was nearing its expiration date, and I wasn't about to let it lapse. We were converting it into a full patent, ironclad, airtight, untouchable. Victor flipped through the documents, his brow furrowing the way it does when he's double-checking every comma. "Did you write this entirely outside of work hours?" he asked without looking up. "Every single line," I said. "On my own machine. No company resources, no overlap with their code base. The original commits are time-stamped. I've got the receipts." "Good," he said, and kept going. We spent the next 3 hours carving the language down to its sharpest possible edge. Every clause that might give them an opening to claim it was work for hire got ripped out and replaced with language that made it clear. This was independent intellectual property, developed without company involvement, fully my property under US law. Even included a statement clarifying that any incidental use of the algorithm in other products without explicit licensing would be considered infringement. The phrasing wasn't just defensive, it was offensive. If they ever tried to contest it, they'd be walking into a legal buzzsaw. By the time Victor slid the final draft back to me for signature, I could feel the tension in my chest easing into something colder, more deliberate. "Once this is filed," he said, "there's no walking it back. You'll own it outright. No company claim, no shared rights. If they're already using it," he let the sentence hang, the implication obvious. "If they're already using it," I said, signing my name in ink that bled slightly into the paper fibers, "then they're already in violation." We filed that afternoon. No announcement, no big dramatic moment, just a quiet submission to the US Patent and Trademark Office, a digital confirmation in my inbox, and the knowledge that the clock had started ticking in a very different way. From that point on, every time Mark strutted through the office bragging about some innovation the team had delivered, I heard the quiet hum of that spring tightening. Every new feature that leaned on my design was another turn of the screw. They thought they were building their empire. I knew they were deepening their dependency on something they didn't own. I didn't rush it. That's the thing about leverage. You don't waste it on small wins. You wait until the stakes are high enough that when you pull the pin, the whole structure rattles. And I had a feeling my moment would come sooner than anyone expected. When the termination meeting finally came, I didn't have to scramble or plot. The setup was already complete. The filing was public record. My name was on it, not theirs. And all I had to do now was decide how and when to use it. That night, my apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the fridge and the occasional car hissing by on wet asphalt outside. My laptop sat open on the dining table. The termination packet Mark had given me earlier shoved off to the side like a bad takeout menu. I wasn't pacing or ranting. I wasn't replaying the scene in his office over and over. I'd already filed it away in my head underdone. What mattered now was the next move. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for, Ellen Reyes, VP of Product at our biggest competitor, someone I'd met years earlier at an industry conference in Denver. We'd stayed in loose contact, usually trading harmless banter about keynote blunders or overpriced networking events. But Ellen was sharp. She had an eye for opportunity, and I knew exactly how she'd see this one. I hit call. It rang twice before her voice came through. Curious but warm. Well, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I've got something you're going to want to see," I said. No small talk, no warm-up. "A fully granted patent, mine, that just happens to cover a technology your competitors are using every single day without legal rights." Silence for a beat, then a slow, amused go on. I explained the background in tight, simple strokes: independent development, clean chain of custody, airtight legal language. I didn't have to overhype it. Ellen understood the implications immediately. "Send me the filings," she said, the sharpness in her voice now replacing the casual tone from moments earlier. I attached the documents to an encrypted email while we stayed on the line. A minute later, I heard her flipping through them, the faint rustle of paper even though I knew she was looking at PDFs. "It's clean," she muttered, half to herself. "And they've been using this for how long? 18 months at least. It's baked into their core products. Pull it and their backend grinds to a halt." I could almost hear her smile. "You looking to license it?" "Exclusively," I said, "and fast." From there, it was all business. We discussed terms in broad strokes: licensing fees, exclusivity windows, non-disclosure clauses. Ellen didn't haggle much. She knew the value, and she knew speed mattered. Every hour before the deal closed was another hour my old company might stumble onto what was coming. But they wouldn't. They'd be too busy congratulating themselves for getting rid of me. By the time we hung up, it was after midnight. The email chain with Ellen's legal department was already rolling, timestamps stacking up like poker chips. They were moving fast, faster than I'd even hoped. I closed my laptop and leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling for a long moment. I didn't feel giddy or vindicated. I felt steady, focused, like I'd just moved a piece across the board and knew without a doubt that the game was now unwinnable for the other side. Revenge, I'd always thought, wasn't about fireworks. It wasn't about yelling or slamming doors. It was about precision. about taking your shot when you were certain it would land and not a second sooner. That call to Ellen, that was the shot. And by morning, the first tremors would be making their way through the walls of Mark's glass office. Ellen didn't waste time. By 9 the next morning, her legal team had combed through every clause, every date stamp, every shred of documentation I'd provided. The verdict came back the way I expected. The patent was rock solid, no gray area for my old company to slip through. We got on a video call, Ellen in her sleek, glass-walled office, yet my kitchen table with a mug of coffee and a notebook I wasn't even writing in. Her first words were straight to the point, "We'll take it. Exclusivity, full term starting immediately. You'll get your first payment within 72 hours. It was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. No drawn-out back and forth, no nitpicking over percentages. They knew this was worth far more than I was asking, but they also knew speed was the real currency here. Every hour between now and public disclosure was a countdown clock for my old company's peace of mind. Within an hour, contracts were in my inbox. I read them twice, not because I doubted Ellen's team, but because this was the moment everything shifted from theoretical to irreversible. My signature would be the point of no return. I signed in digital ink, date and time stamped, and sent it back without ceremony. Ellen called me again 10 minutes later. Press release is being finalized now. We're putting it on the wire this afternoon. I imagined the ripple effect. Some junior analyst at my old company's PR department spotting the headline, forwarding it to a manager, who would then sprint it up the food chain until it landed in the CTO's inbox like a live grenade. By the time Mark saw it, the fuse would already be burning fast. Ellen read me the draft over the phone. Competitor name secures exclusive rights to breakthrough algorithm powering next-generation systems. No mention of my old company by name, none needed. Industry insiders would know exactly who'd just been kneecapped. And for those who didn't, the next earnings report would spell it out in fine, brutal detail. We coordinated the timing down to the minute. Their PR team would drop the release right before the East Coast lunch hour, when corporate types mindlessly scroll headlines between meetings. Just enough time for the news to spread before the markets closed, ensuring a nice visible dip in my old company's stock price before the day was out. After we hung up, I didn't pace or hover over my inbox. I went about my morning, watered my plants, took out the trash, made another cup of coffee. Work was already done. All that was left was gravity taking over. There's a certain clarity that comes in moments like that. It's not triumph or gloating. It's knowing you've lined everything up so perfectly that once you let go, there's no way to stop it. I'd loaded the spring a month ago. Ellen had just helped me release it. By sundown, my old company would be dealing with more than they could spin, and Mark, who once laughed about how quickly they could replace me, would find out exactly how expensive that replacement really was. The press release hit at 11:42 a.m. sharp. It didn't need bells or whistles, just a clean headline that landed like a hammer. Competitor name acquires exclusive rights to core technology driving industry innovation. Within minutes, it was everywhere. Trade journals picked it up first, followed by tech blogs hungry for clicks, and the mainstream business outlets that knew a good corporate drama when they saw one. By noon, the headline was making its way through LinkedIn feeds like wildfire, every repost and share accompanied by a little burst of speculation. Does an old company name use this tech? Wonder how this will impact their Q3 projections. I didn't need to wonder how it was playing in Mark's office. I could picture it, middle managers peeking over cubicle walls, scrolling through the release on their phones, quietly messaging each other, "Have you seen this?" Slack channels blowing up in frantic side threads. The market didn't wait for an internal memo. By 1 p.m., the stock had dipped 6% and was still sliding. It wasn't a catastrophic crash yet, but in corporate terms, it was a bright red flare in the middle of the trading day. Someone in investor relations was already writing statements full of phrases like business continuity and minimal operational impact. I sat at my kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee, reading the press release for the fifth time. My name wasn't in the headline, it didn't need to be, but it was right there in the body, exactly where I wanted it. Patent holder, my name. Exclusive licensing agreement with competitor name ensures proprietary application of the technology. There's a special kind of satisfaction in knowing you don't have to say a word for people to connect the dots. Everyone in our niche corner of the industry knew who I was. Everyone at my old company definitely knew who I was. And the fact that I hadn't made a single public comment, that would drive Mark insane. He'd be desperate to know what I'd told them, how much I'd been paid, whether I'd planned this from the start. The truth was simpler. My hands were clean. I hadn't hacked anything, stolen anything, or broken a single law. I just exercised a right I'd secured 2 years earlier and waited for the right moment to use it. Somewhere in that glass office of his, Mark would be reading the same release, probably for the 10th time, his jaw tightening with each pass. And somewhere else in the building, the CTO's phone would be lighting up with questions from the board, from investors, from journalists smelling blood. All I had to do was sit back, sip my coffee, and let the chain reaction play out exactly as I'd designed it. The fuse was lit, and there was no putting it out now. By late afternoon, the real storm had broken. My phone stayed silent, but that didn't mean I wasn't getting updates. A friend from accounting, one of the few people I actually trusted there, started feeding me a steady stream of messages from the war zone. The first one was just 4 words: CTO is losing it. The second, you won't believe this, conference call on speaker. Whole floor can hear. I could picture the scene perfectly. The big executive conference room, blinds half closed, a scatter of half-empty coffee cups, and the CTO standing at the head of the table, phone on speaker, voice booming. What I don't understand, Mark, he said, my friend typed every word, is why your name is on this patent. And why? As of this morning, it's licensed exclusively to our biggest competitor. Apparently, there was a pause long enough for everyone to hear the faint rustle of papers as Mark tried to gather himself. Then came his stammered reply. It was part of the internal documentation process. I supervised you insisted on attaching your name, the CTO cut in, voice sharp enough to make the whole table flinch. And now every investor, every client, every media outlet thinks you handed over our core technology to the competition. Personally, there it was, the knife twisting exactly where I'd aimed it. Mark's ego, the same one that made him slap his name on work he couldn't explain if his life depended on it, had just made him the public face of a corporate disaster. The execs in that room weren't looking at the CTO. They were looking at Mark. And in those kinds of rooms, perception is reality. If your name is on the problem, you are the problem. Back in my kitchen, I stirred cream into my coffee and leaned over to water the little pothos plant Mark once tried to turn into an insult. Its leaves were bigger now, fuller. It was thriving in ways he never imagined it could. My friend's last message came through a few minutes later, they're demanding answers. He's sweating through his shirt. I smiled, not out of cruelty, but out of precision. This wasn't about screaming matches or dramatic confrontations. This was about setting the dominoes just right and watching them fall. Mark had spent years making me the invisible guy in the room. Now, with the whole company's future on the line, he couldn't disappear if he tried. And me? I was exactly where I wanted to be, off their radar, coffee in hand, plants thriving, watching it all play out from the quiet comfort of my own home. The next morning, they didn't even get the mercy of waking up to a quiet news cycle. At 8:07 a.m., Ellen's company dropped a follow-up press release, short, surgical, devastating. It not only confirmed the exclusivity deal but included, in crisp black and white, the publicly filed patent record. Right there under inventors was my name and Mark's. They didn't have to explain the history. Anyone who read that line could draw their own conclusions. The same Mark whose name sat proudly on the document was now the guy who'd let that patent walk straight into a competitor's hands. The industry blogs were merciless. One headline read, from innovation to litigation, how one exec gift-wrapped tech for the competition. By 9 a.m., the board had called an emergency meeting. My friend in accounting texted me from the elevator. Looks like half the exec team just got summoned. Mark looks like he aged 10 years overnight. Inside that room, the story was spiraling. Investor calls were stacking up, clients were asking for assurances, and the legal department was being pushed to find something we can sue over. They tried. God, they tried. But Victor's airtight language in the patent left no cracks. Every timestamp, every version history commit, every sworn statement proved it was developed independently. I owned it outright, and they'd been using it without a license for nearly 2 years. When legal finally delivered the news, there's nothing we can do. We have no claim. It must have landed like a sledgehammer. I imagined the silence in that room, the quick glances exchanged over the table, the mental math of how many careers had just gone up in smoke. Somewhere in the middle of that meeting, Ellen's PR team updated their press page with a photo of the two of us shaking hands, taken years earlier at that industry conference in Denver. The caption? Longtime industry relationship results in strategic partnership. It was petty. It was perfect. By noon, word had leaked internally that Mark's position was under review. The kind of phrase that's just a polite prelude to clean out your desk. HR had gone from smugly watching me walk out the door to quietly drafting exit paperwork for one of their own golden boys. I spent that afternoon in my living room, sunlight streaming across the hardwood, sipping coffee, while I pruned the same pothos plant Mark had once tried to turn into a punchline. Its vines trailed thick and green now, curling along the edge of the pot in lazy loops. It wasn't just alive, it was thriving. So was I. And every time I looked at that plant, I was reminded of something Mark never understood. In the right hands, even the smallest, most overlooked thing can grow into something that takes over the whole damn room. Appreciate you sticking around, you legends of the break room. Subscribe for more chaos. Let's make your old manager spill their coffee in fear.